For Jack Turner, the air of home always smelled like rain. Sharp, salty, restless, and colder than he remembered. The old Navy sailor stepped off the battered bus in Astoria, Oregon,
He's the one.
boots sinking into the wet gravel as the driver shut the door behind him. He wore his uniform jacket out of habit, the only piece of his former life that seemed to fit anymore. It didn't stop the sting of recognition. How even familiar streets felt like somewhere he was only passing through. His first stop wasn't his shack on the rocks, but the little diner that clung to the edge of the docks like a barnacle. Inside, neon lights flickered against scratched windows. The same faces, locals and fishermen, weathered by the Pacific winds, cast glances over their mugs. For a heartbeat, it seemed as if Jack was invisible, a shadow among shadows. But old friends, and even family, had their way of cutting through the silence. Years at sea, and all you've got left is that rotten shack on the rocks, someone called across the room. The words a blend of laughter and pity. Forks scraped plates. Even his cousin shrugged at him from a corner booth, a helpless gesture that said, "That's just how folks are here." Jack offered no reply, just a polite nod, slipping his hands deeper into his coat. He let their words fall away like rain off a slicker. He was used to being misunderstood. Sometimes it felt easier that way. Before the story goes on, tell me, where are you watching from? And please like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you won't miss what's next. Outside, the sky sagged with storm clouds. Jack walked the path to the rocky island, nothing more than a hunk of moss and pine lashed by the sea, connected to the mainland by a footbridge barely holding together. The cabin perched there, half rotten, half repaired. It had been his grandfather's once, then his father's, then left to the weather and wildness. Now it was Jack's, for better or worse. He unlocked the swollen door, the hinges groaning a familiar complaint. Inside, everything was as he'd left it. Dust motes dancing in strips of gray light, a stove that always needed coaxing, the old photographs curling at the edges. The silence settled over him like a heavy blanket. He got to work with a quiet urgency, unpacking his duffel and sweeping up the worst of the driftwood and debris. The world shrank to simple things: the scrape of the broom, the clink of a mug, the hiss of wind rattling the glass. As the sun faded, Jack stepped outside, letting the storm's chill wake him up. That was when he saw it. A flash of movement near the tree line, almost lost against the underbrush. At first, he thought it was just a stray dog or maybe a coyote, something wild that had drifted too close. But as he looked closer, the animal stood its ground, amber eyes fixed on him with unsettling calm. A bobcat, lean, mud-splattered, with one paw held awkwardly off the ground. Jack's first instinct was caution. Years at sea and in service had taught him the value of not rushing toward the unknown. He kept his distance, watching the animal breathe, watching the pulse of wariness in its body. Rain ticked against the leaves. The bobcat didn't flee or snarl. It simply watched him, wounded and proud. For a long moment, man and animal faced each other, separated by just a patch of wild earth. Something in those golden eyes struck Jack, some mix of exhaustion and stubbornness he recognized in himself. Maybe, he thought, we're both out of place here. Jack took a slow step back, not wanting to spook the creature. But as he did, the bobcat limped a little closer, as if testing his intentions. He could see now, a deep gash along its flank, half hidden by wet fur. It must have tangled with something bigger or sharper in the woods. Kneeling in the dirt, Jack spoke softly, letting the rain swallow his words. He didn't expect the bobcat to understand, but the act of talking calmed him, grounding him in something real. After a few minutes, he retreated inside, returning with an old first aid kit, moving slow and steady. The bobcat bristled but did not run. Bit by bit, the distance closed. Jack tossed a scrap of jerky, then another. The animal ate, cautiously at first, then with a desperate hunger. In time, the pain made it sway, and Jack, careful as a surgeon, pressed a clean cloth to the wound. The bobcat snarled, more out of fear than anger, but it let him work. He bound the injury with a strip of bandage, hands shaking, heart pounding. When it was over, the animal sat back on its haunches, trembling but upright. Jack looked at it and said, "Ash, that's your name." He didn't know why, but it felt right. Ash, like the forest after a fire, scarred but surviving. The storm rolled in, the sky split by lightning. Jack rose, feeling the ache in his knees, and stepped back toward the cabin. Ash watched him go, then limped off into the trees, swallowed by darkness. For the first time in months, Jack felt a flicker of connection, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he belonged here after all. Inside, as thunder shook the roof, Jack turned over the day's events. His friends' laughter echoed, but it no longer stung. The island, the cabin, even the wounded bobcat. They were reminders that some things were worth facing, no matter how broken they looked from the outside. Outside, the rain continued. Jack drifted to sleep with the image of Ash's golden eyes burned into his memory, knowing the world was shifting, quietly, profoundly, beneath his feet. Dawn always arrived slow and pale on the Oregon coast, creeping in under door frames and through thin curtains. Jack awoke to the restless wind and the lingering chill of the storm. The first thing he did was check outside, half hoping, half dreading the sight of Ash. The forest was still. Only the distant caw of gulls and the rustle of pine needles answered him. Jack carried on, drawn into the simple rhythm of survival. He boiled water on the old stove, patched the roof, and scrubbed years of neglect from every corner of the cabin. Sometimes he caught glimpses of movement in the trees, a flick of a tail, a flash of amber eyes. Ash kept his distance, but Jack left scraps of food near the edge of the clearing, and each morning they disappeared. One afternoon, as Jack swept under the battered rug by the wood stove, the broom handle thunked against something solid. He paused, pushing aside the faded fabric, and discovered a seam in the floorboards, almost invisible but once seen, impossible to ignore. His heart thudded. The memories of childhood stories about the cabin's secrets returned, tales his grandfather used to spin while whittling wood by lamplight. Most had seemed like harmless fantasy. Jack knelt, feeling the edges of the boards with his fingers. The seam ran in a perfect square, too precise for nature. He fetched a screwdriver and pried up the nearest board, hands slick with anticipation and a faint undercurrent of fear. Beneath the surface, hidden under layers of dust and cobwebs, he found an old iron ring set into the wood. It took all his strength and leverage to lift the panel. The hinges groaned as if woken from a century-long sleep, and a cold draft curled up from below. A trapdoor, so well hidden it could have been missed for generations. Jack's pulse raced as he grabbed a flashlight and peered into the gloom. The space beneath the cabin wasn't just a crawl space or a storm cellar. It was a room, small but deep, lined with shelves, boxes, and the glint of metal against stone. Descending the rickety ladder, Jack entered a world frozen in time. Dust lay thick on every surface. The walls were covered in yellowed blueprints and diagrams, their corners curling with age. Strange devices, half-assembled and crusted with rust, cluttered the workbenches. He ran his hand over a stack of leather-bound notebooks, the covers embossed with his grandfather's initials. C.T. Jack recognized the neat, looping handwriting. He remembered sitting on his grandfather's knee, listening to tales of storms that could swallow whole ships and of inventions meant to outsmart the sea itself. Here, those stories had become reality. Rows of diagrams mapped out machines he couldn't quite comprehend. One, more detailed than the rest, caught his eye. A blueprint for a storm warning device, complex and elegant, with notations in the margins and corrections penned in red ink. He read through the notes, heart pounding. His grandfather had spent years developing a system to detect and warn of approaching storms, hoping to save lives along the coast. But the final pages grew frantic, the handwriting slanting hard to the right, a warning repeated again and again. A historic storm will one day swallow Oregon's coast. Finish this, someone must finish this. Jack realized with a chill that this wasn't just a relic of his grandfather's obsession. It was a legacy, unfinished, urgent, and left in his hands. The world above was changing, the coast more vulnerable than ever to the tempests that rolled in from the Pacific. As Jack examined the blueprints, he heard a faint scratching noise from above. He climbed back into the cabin, muscles tight with unease, and found Ash curled near the stove, eyes narrowed but calm. The Bobcat's bandage was stained but holding. Jack approached carefully, refreshing the dressing with trembling hands. He could feel Ash's warmth, the wild pulse of a creature forged in adversity. In the flickering firelight, the connection between them felt both fragile and necessary. Night fell, wind battering the windows. Jack sat at the table, the blueprints spread before him, the weight of two legacies pressing down. His grandfather's hopes and warnings echoed in his mind. So did his own doubts. The failures that trailed him from the Navy, the laughter in the diner, the sense of being adrift even on solid ground. But as the hours stretched on, a new resolve took root. Jack understood that this was no longer about proving himself to his family or the locals. It was about honoring a promise made generations ago, a promise to stand between the storm and those who couldn't see it coming. He gathered the notebooks and tools, carrying them into the weak dawn. The first real step had been taken. Jack wasn't sure what waited in the days ahead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt the certainty of purpose, a soldier out of place but no longer lost. Days drifted together on the island, marked by the tides and the shifting moods of the Pacific. Jack lost himself in repairs and rituals, patching the leaking roof, gathering driftwood, nursing Ash's wound as the Bobcat moved with cautious acceptance around the clearing. In those quiet hours, there was a sense of uneasy peace. It was the kind of calm that settles over a battlefield when the smoke clears, but before the bodies are counted, a peace that knows it won't last. The secret room beneath the cabin became Jack's refuge and burden. He spent hours hunched over the blueprints, tracing the careful lines and cryptic symbols his grandfather had left behind. The storm warning device took shape in his mind. Coils of copper wire, glass tubes, the skeletons of strange antennas. But the details tangled together, incomplete. The final connections always just out of reach. It was clear that whatever his grandfather had built, he hadn't finished it. Jack tried not to dwell on the warnings scrawled in the margins, but the words echoed at the edges of his thoughts. A historic storm will one day swallow Oregon's coast. The urgency in the handwriting was unmistakable, as if the old man had glimpsed something terrible looming on the horizon. Still, Jack pressed on. He cleaned rust from terminals, sorted through jars of bolts and wires, and made lists of what he had and what he'd need. The isolation that once felt suffocating now provided focus. If he could complete the device, maybe he could make good on the promise left beneath these floorboards. Maybe he could become more than a punchline in a diner full of old ghosts. Each night, the wind rattled the windows and the pines, but Jack found comfort in the slow, steady rhythm of work. He cooked meals on the old stove, set aside scraps for Ash, and spoke aloud to fill the silence. Though the bobcat mostly responded with narrowed eyes and the occasional huff of breath. It wasn't until he began assembling a small module, a cluster of glass tubes and copper coils, that the piece began to fracture. Jack wired the module according to the plans, double and triple checking every connection. His hands shook as he attached the power source, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then a thin, sharp whine filled the air, barely audible above the hiss of rain. The module emitted a pulsing, staccato radio signal, like the beat of a nervous heart. Jack felt a surge of hope. He scrambled for the old shortwave radio stored on a shelf, tuning through the static. Amid the usual ghostly chatter, he caught the echo of his own signal, a looping code, strange and insistent. It wasn't much, but it proved the machine could speak. But as night fell, unease settled over the cabin. Jack couldn't shake the sense that, in activating the machine, he had sent more than a signal out into the world. There were times, after sunset, when he thought he heard something. A distant clang, the crunch of gravel, the echo of voices across the water. He dismissed these as tricks of the mind, but Ash seemed restless too, prowling the perimeter of the clearing with low, growling breaths. It was nearly midnight when Jack stood on the porch, mug of bitter coffee warming his hands, and saw a faint, flickering light out on the waves. At first, he thought it was nothing, just a lantern swinging on a passing boat. But the light didn't move on. It circled, drifting closer to the island with an unsettling patience, its beam sweeping across the rocks and brush like a searchlight. Jack watched in silence, heart pounding. He had always known that the solitude of the island was a fragile shield. Now, he wondered who might be drawn to this place, what they might want. He turned off the porch lamp and slipped inside, peering through the curtains as the boat drifted nearer. The engine sputtered to life, then cut out, leaving only the slap of water and the whine of wind. He couldn't see the faces of the figures on board, but their silhouettes moved with purpose. The boat circled the dock twice, then retreated back into the night, its light winking out. Jack waited for what felt like hours, but the only visitors were the swirling fog and the persistent, salt-heavy breeze. Sleep came fitfully. Jack woke before dawn, checking the shore for any sign of intruders. There were footprints, fresh in the mud, too big to be his own, pressed deep by heavy boots. Someone had come close in the darkness, close enough to study the cabin, maybe even to listen at the windows. The realization sent a cold shock through him. In the days that followed, Jack worked with a new sense of urgency. He locked away the blueprints and hid the unfinished machine beneath a pile of old crates. He began carrying the hunting knife his father left behind, watching the water for the return of the fishing boat and its silent crew. Ash grew restless, refusing to linger by the fire or the food scraps for long. The bobcat circled the clearing, ears twitching, body taut and wary. Jack understood. Whatever signal he had sent, it had not gone unheard. Out on the margins of the island, danger was closing in, and still, overhead, The skies darkened. The storm wasn't coming yet, but Jack could feel it, waiting, watching, like something huge and inevitable just beyond the horizon. Days on the island bled into one another, marked by restless wind and the ceaseless pounding of surf against jagged rocks. Jack became a shadow in his own life, moving from task to task with purpose sharpened by fear. His eyes drifted often to the edge of the clearing, watching for the flicker of a tail or a pair of golden eyes, signs that Ash was still alive and prowling the woods. The bobcat's presence, wild and wary, became Jack's talisman against loneliness, a reminder that something untamed could survive, even here. But the sense of safety was thin as frost. Each night, Jack double-checked the locks and barricaded the trap door, pushing crates over its hidden seam. He couldn't shake the memory of fresh footprints near the dock or the circling light from the mysterious fishing boat. He worked by day on the storm warning device, but at night he kept a flashlight and hunting knife by his bed, sleep slipping away in fractured pieces. The fishermen returned when the sky hung low and gray with the promise of rain. Jack heard them first, the cough of an outboard motor muffled by the roar of the surf. He peered through a gap in the curtains, heart thudding as he saw the boat nosing up to the rickety dock. 4 men climbed out, their slickers gleaming and faces obscured by hoods. They moved with the confidence of those who had done this before, their boots leaving dark marks across the weathered planks. Jack didn't wait for a knock. He stepped out onto the porch, careful to keep the door at his back, and forced his posture into the quiet alertness that had once served him well at sea. The fishermen paused, glancing at one another before one of them, a broad man with a scar curling over his cheek, offered a forced grin. "Storm's blowing in," the man said, voice loud in the hush of the morning. The others spread out, eyes scanning the yard, the trees, the windows of the cabin. Jack offered nothing but a nod, every muscle tensed. He could feel the shape of the knife in his pocket and the weight of secrets in the ground beneath his feet. The men asked casual questions. If he was alone, how long he planned to stay, if he'd seen anything odd in the woods. Their words were wrapped in the trappings of friendliness, but underneath, Jack caught the probing edge of suspicion. They glanced toward the cabin door, lingered at the patched windows, and shifted their attention to the battered solar panels and antenna on the roof. Ash appeared at the edge of the clearing, fur bristling, tail lashing low. The bobcat's eyes flashed, and a low growl carried on the wind. The fisherman froze, staring at the animal as if unsure whether it was more pet or threat. Jack felt a surge of relief and fear. The bobcat's appearance changed the air, a wild barrier drawn between him and the strangers. Scarcheek tried to laugh it off, remarking that only fools and madmen kept wild animals for company. Jack held his ground, sensing the tension beneath their words. The other men drifted toward the dock, murmuring to each other in voices too low to catch. Ash didn't move, muscles tight, every hair standing on end. It became clear the visit was a test. The men weren't just here to chat about the weather. They wanted something. Answers, perhaps, or a look inside the cabin. When Jack refused their invitation to come down to the boat for a drink, the mood sharpened, their eyes hardened, and the false warmth faded. After a few more tense minutes, the fishermen retreated. Jack watched them go, heart pounding, unable to relax even as the boat pulled away and disappeared behind a curtain of mist. He waited, motionless, until the last echo of the motor faded. Only then did he let himself breathe. Inside, the cabin felt colder, the walls thinner, as if the visit had unsettled something deep within its bones. Jack checked the windows, tested the locks again, and swept the floor for any sign that the men had tried to force entry. Ash reappeared at the door, limping slightly but eyes alert. Jack knelt beside the bobcat, his hands shaking as he scratched behind its ears. The animal tolerated the contact, gaze fixed on the trees as if daring the world to come closer. That night, Jack didn't sleep. He sat at the table with the blueprints spread before him, the lamp throwing wild shadows across the pages. The storm warning device was still incomplete, and now there was no denying it. Someone knew he was hiding something. The module's radio signal must have drawn their attention, a flare on the horizon that brought hungry eyes to his isolated refuge. The island no longer felt like a sanctuary. It was a target, and Jack was alone. Except for the bobcat, his battered faith, and the unfinished work of a man long dead. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the glass and making the trees moan. He realized, in that trembling darkness, that the next time the fishermen returned, it wouldn't just be to ask questions. They'd come for whatever secrets lay beneath the cabin, and this time, they might not take no for an answer. The days after the fishermen's visit grew shorter and colder, every cloud heavier with the threat of rain. Jack kept busy with the routines that kept him sane, chopping wood, boiling coffee, feeding Ash, and checking the wound each morning as the bobcat silently tolerated his care. But his focus fractured, the sense of safety worn thin. He could feel a new urgency in the air, a sense that time was running out and the enemy was closing in. The storm warning device, once a puzzle to occupy lonely hours, became an obsession. Jack pored over his grandfather's blueprints by the weak light of dawn and again by lamplight long into the night. Each diagram, each scribbled note, felt like a lifeline stretching across time, a thread he clung to even as it unraveled in his hands. He tried assembling the device just as the plans described. He gathered the copper wire, soldered the glass tubes, wound the coils, and set the antenna high above the cabin's roof. He measured every connection, checked every circuit, hands trembling with a mix of anticipation and fear. But when he switched it on, the machine sputtered, sparked, and fell silent. He tried again, adjusting wires, cleaning contacts, following every instruction. The result was the same, a brief surge of static, then nothing. Jack wanted to scream. He felt the old, familiar bitterness surge up, a soldier's fury at battles lost for reasons beyond his understanding. He slammed the workbench with his fist, the sound ringing in the small room, the echo of defeat hanging heavy in the air. Outside, rain began to fall, steady and cold, blurring the world beyond the windows. Jack sat beside the stove, staring at the failed machine and the scattered pages of blueprints. Ash slipped inside, shaking droplets from his fur, then settled beside the fire, yellow eyes never leaving Jack's shadowed face. The next morning, as Jack tinkered with the broken device, he realized the radio signal had changed. The module that had once sent a quiet, stuttering pulse now emitted a louder, more persistent broadcast. The whine filled the cabin, and Jack's gut twisted with dread. The fishermen, whoever they were, whatever they wanted, would hear it too. The signal had become a beacon, marking his island, his hiding place, for anyone watching. He tried to dampen the signal, pulling wires and disconnecting circuits, but each attempt seemed to make the noise worse. It was as if the device had a mind of its own, and the more he fought it, the more insistent the call became. Jack shut it down, heart pounding, the silence that followed almost worse than the noise. For the first time, he let himself admit the truth. Defending the cabin, hiding in the woods, patching the roof, none of it would save him now. Unless he finished the machine, unless he could decipher what his grandfather had left behind and make the storm warning device truly work, he had no way to protect himself or anyone else from what was coming. He returned to the trap door, searching the underground lab for anything he might have missed. He scoured the notebooks for patterns, clues, half-finished sketches. He spent hours tracing every circuit in the blueprints, hunting for the one missing link, the single insight that would bring it all together. Frustration gnawed at him, sleepless nights turning to blurry dawns as the rain beat a ceaseless rhythm overhead. Jack's mind wandered to the past. Long nights at sea, the hum of machinery in the engine room, the desperate hope of finding safe harbor. He remembered his grandfather's stories, not just about storms and inventions, but about the stubborn courage needed to face the unknown. He realized that knowledge, no matter how carefully preserved, was never enough on its own. It took something more: adaptation, faith, and the will to try again when failure seemed inevitable. He started to notice other changes around the island. The boat with its silent crew returned some evenings, circling just out of sight, its running lights dimmed as if stalking prey. Ash became more anxious, sometimes disappearing for a day at a time, returning with new scratches and tufts of fur missing. Once, Jack found footprints near the forest's edge, deep and deliberate, as if someone had stood there for hours, watching. Jack doubled his efforts. He mapped out every circuit anew, trying combinations his grandfather had never tried, cobbling together scraps from broken radios and old marine equipment. His hands grew raw and his eyes burned from lack of sleep, but still the machine refused to work. One evening, while Jack sifted through a box of weathered photographs and faded letters, he found a slip of paper with a final note from his grandfather. The handwriting was shaky but urgent. "The key is in the storm. Don't fear failure. Trust the pattern." Jack turned the words over in his mind, searching for meaning in the riddles of the past. He knew now that defending the cabin was no longer enough. The storm, both literal and human, was closing in. If he was to protect his grandfather's legacy, and maybe save more lives than his own, he would have to finish the device, no matter the cost. With the first flashes of lightning on the horizon, Jack returned to his workbench, the battered blueprints spread out before him, the weight of generations pressing down. There would be no more waiting, no more hiding. It was time to build, to fight, and to face whatever storm waited in the darkness. The first true storm of the season arrived before dawn, blowing in from the sea with a fury Jack had only known during his worst days in the Navy. The wind howled through the trees, slamming rain against the glass and rattling every window in the old cabin. Jack barely noticed. He was lost in the work, surrounded by the tangle of copper wire, old radio guts, tubes, and fragile notes scrawled in his grandfather's looping hand. Failure had become his companion, every misstep a lesson, every setback a provocation. Sleep was a luxury he could no longer afford. For weeks, Jack had thrown himself into the design, testing, failing, and rebuilding. His fingers grew rough, nails caked with oil and grime. He watched storms roll in from the porch, memorizing the way clouds moved, the pressure drops, the rhythm of the tides. It was as if nature itself had become both adversary and teacher, battering him with questions he could not ignore. The isolation, once a weight on his chest, now served as protection, at least when it came to the human threat that circled ever closer. The fisherman's boat had returned several times, always at dusk or dawn, lingering in the fog. Sometimes Jack saw flashes of metal on the shore. Binoculars, maybe, or the glint of a rifle's barrel. The men never landed, but their message was clear. The island was not as invisible as Jack had once believed. He kept the doors locked, the trap door hidden, and the knife within reach at all times. Ash became a ghost in the woods, appearing less and less frequently, but each visit brought fresh proof of violence. New scratches along the bobcat's flank, fur matted with dried blood, eyes fierce and wary. Jack left food near the tree line, watching as Ash stalked closer, muscles tense, wounds raw. There was an understanding between them, a wordless pact. Each alone, each hunted, but bound by survival and stubbornness. As the storm season worsened, Jack realized that the fishermen were biding their time. Even they seemed unwilling to brave the full wrath of the Pacific when thunder cracked the sky and waves battered the dock to splinters. Jack caught glimpses of them in the distance, sometimes camped in their boat, sometimes gone for days. But he knew they would come again, armed, determined, and desperate for whatever secrets the island held. Meanwhile, the machine slowly took shape. Jack combed through his grandfather's notebooks, focusing on the smallest details, the margins, the odd turns of phrase. He sketched new diagrams, tested components from old radios, repurposed anything he could find. Solar batteries, coils stripped from ancient motors, transistors that buzzed and hummed like angry insects. Each new build brought him closer, yet each failure stung sharper as the sense of impending doom grew. One afternoon, while a pale sun broke through the clouds, Jack heard something, a low, guttural snarl from the woods. He raced outside, thinking of Ash, but found only fresh tracks in the mud, the imprint of boots beside animal paw prints. The fishermen had tried to land again, but turned back, leaving evidence of their presence and a smear of blood on a broken branch. Jack's heart hammered. He knew now that neither the bobcat nor the cabin would remain safe for much longer. Driven by fear and purpose, Jack redoubled his efforts. He rebuilt the antenna, using the old flagpole and copper scavenged from the cabin's ancient wiring. He devised a crude shield for the electronics, waterproofing the device with tar and tape, praying it would survive the coming tempest. Each night, the wind grew louder, and the trees leaned further toward the cabin as if urging him to hurry. It was during one such night, as lightning flashed over the sea and the fisherman's boat rocked on the waves, that Jack made a breakthrough. Guided by the memory of his grandfather's voice and the cryptic note, "The key is in the storm. Don't fear failure. Trust the pattern." Jack realized he had been overthinking the connections, treating the machine like a puzzle to be solved instead of a song to be played. He stripped the device down to its core, focusing on harmony instead of precision, letting instinct and experience guide his hands. Hours passed, the storm rising, until at last he stood back, sweat and rain mingling on his brow, the machine humming with potential. Then came the real test. Outside, the fisherman's boat slammed into the dock, men spilling onto the shore with flashlights and weapons. Jack braced the cabin doors, heart pounding as Ash burst from the darkness, a blur of claws and fury slashing at the intruders, buying precious seconds. Thunder rolled, windows rattled, and waves crashed against the rocks. Inside, Jack rushed to fit the final components, hands shaking as the storm howled around him. He glanced out at the chaos, men fighting to reach the cabin, the bobcat darting between trees, the world torn apart by wind and water. The device was ready. It was now or never. The cliffhanger lingered like electricity in the air. would he send the warning before the storm rips the cabin apart? The wind was a living beast, howling through the trees, battering the battered cabin as if determined to pry it from the rocks and hurl it into the hungry sea. Rain lashed sideways in stinging sheets, and each flash of lightning painted the world in stark, trembling white. Inside, the old walls groaned, the lights flickered, and the air was thick with the coppery tang of fear and sweat. Jack moved as if in a trance, every motion sharpened by adrenaline. He jammed the last tube into its socket, hands slick and trembling. The machine, years in the making, born of obsession and desperation, sat on the scarred table, a patchwork of his grandfather's genius and Jack's brute determination. Outside, chaos reigned, shouts carried by the gale, boots thudding on the porch, and the distant primal scream of ash somewhere in the storm. For a heartbeat, Jack hesitated. Doubt rose up like a wave. One more failure, one more defeat, one more mistake with the weight of lives on its back. But there was no time left for doubt. He twisted the main dial, closed his eyes, and flipped the switch. The cabin's lights dimmed. The machine sputtered, then surged with a rising whine that drowned out even the roar of the wind. A blue spark arced through the air, filling the room with ozone and the acrid stink of burning dust. Jack forced himself to breathe, fingers dancing over the controls, heart hammering as the device's radio transmitter found its frequency. A pulsing, urgent signal, crafted by hands decades apart, but united by need. The storm pounded against the roof, tearing shingles loose, hurling branches against the windows. Out on the porch, the fishermen slammed against the door, cursing, their voices wild with anger and fear. The knob rattled, the hinges shrieked, but Jack barely heard. All his focus narrowed to the device, to the slow climb of the signal strength, to the hope that someone, anyone, on the mainland would hear the warning. Suddenly, a gunshot shattered the night. The window above the sink exploded inward, shards of glass stinging Jack's face. The door shook as the intruders heaved against it, pounding with the butts of their rifles, feet scraping on wet wood. For a split second, Jack's resolve faltered. But then Ash was there, a living shadow, launching from the darkness with a snarl that rose above the wind. The bobcat crashed into the nearest man, claws flashing in the sickly yellow light. There was a scream, wild and panicked, and a thud as someone went down. The others spun, weapons flailing, firing blindly into the storm and the shadows. Ash moved like fire, a streak of muscle and fury, giving Jack the seconds he needed. Another crash. The door finally gave. 3 men surged into the cabin, faces wild, rain dripping from their slickers. Jack grabbed the machine, shielding it with his body as the intruders closed in. One swung a flashlight, its beam slashing through the dimness, landing on the device. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. The lead fisherman lunged for Jack, but Ash was there first, bursting from behind a toppled chair, jaws snapping on the man's arm. Gunfire thundered, splinters flew, but Jack ducked and rolled, clutching the machine. He scrambled across the floor, found cover behind the table, and yanked the device's portable antenna upright. The transmitter howled, filling the cabin with a deafening static. Through the cacophony, Jack's fingers found the emergency code his grandfather had drilled into his memory all those years ago. He tapped it out. 3 long, 3 short, 3 long, a desperate plea in the universal language of distress. Outside, the sea surged higher, waves slamming against the rocks, sending spray through the shattered windows. The world shrank to chaos and darkness and noise. Boots stomping, Ash's war cries, the machine's relentless drone. Jack felt blood trickle down his face, tasted salt and fear and desperation. But the transmitter kept singing, the signal building, climbing higher and higher into the ether. A lightning strike hit the old flagpole, sending sparks raining across the yard. The fisherman faltered, backing away as ash pressed the attack. Jack seized the moment, kicking the table over and shielding the device with his body. He could see, through a break in the storm, the faint flash of lights on the mainland. Maybe rescue, maybe just another fishing boat braving the gale. The device's indicator light burned steady green. The warning had gone out, riding the airwaves above the fury of the storm. Jack felt a wild, ragged hope surge in his chest. He'd done it. He'd reached them. He'd kept the promise. His grandfather's, his own. Outside, the world was coming apart. The roof lifting, the wind screaming, the bobcat's silhouette vanishing into the rain. The fisherman staggered back, one clutching his torn arm, the others stumbling for the safety of their boat, their courage shattered by the storm and the wild thing they could not tame. Jack collapsed beside the device, breath ragged, the cabin shuddering around him. The transmitter's song faded, replaced by the dull roar of the wind and the distant wail of sirens from across the water. Hundreds of lives would be spared tonight. He knew it deep in his bones, a sailor's certainty, a legacy fulfilled. The price was not yet clear, but in that moment, Jack Turner had stood against the sea, against violence and fate, and sent hope into the heart of the storm. The storm rolled east by dawn, chased off the Oregon coast by a vanguard of bruised clouds and a rising wind sharp with cold. For hours after the signal was sent, Jack lay among the splinters of his grandfather's table, arms wrapped around the battered warning device. The world outside nothing but the deafening chorus of wind and rain and the echo of violence still trembling in his bones. Sleep came in broken snatches, more exhaustion than rest, as the storm slowly lost its voice. At last, silence, or something close. A hush so heavy it pressed on the shattered windows and shivered across the ruined floorboards. Jack forced himself upright, every muscle aching, every scrape and bruise stinging as he surveyed what remained. The old cabin was gutted. Shingles had torn loose, scattering like broken shells across the clearing. The porch was gone, the wood splintered and scattered halfway to the dock. One of the inner walls had collapsed, leaving a jagged wound that let in the bitter morning air. The only thing left whole was the machine, its single green light still winking in defiance. Jack staggered outside, bracing himself against the icy wind. The world looked as if it had been scoured raw. The pines were stripped and bent, the dock battered nearly to kindling. The fisherman's boat was nowhere to be seen. No bodies, no sign of the men who had tried to take what wasn't theirs. Only torn-up earth and muddy footprints quickly fading beneath the thin blanket of snow the storm had dragged in from the sea. There was blood, too. Dark smears on the steps, spattering the rocks, tracing a desperate arc toward the edge of the woods. Fear gripped Jack, sharper than any pain. He limped after the trail, boots crunching the icy crust, heart pounding in his throat. He found a tuft of sandy fur snagged on a bramble, a streak of red against the pale green moss. Ash. The bobcat's tracks zigzagged through the brush, unsteady, as if the animal had fought to stay upright. Jack called out, voice ragged in the cold, but there was no answer except the shriek of gulls overhead and the distant creak of tree limbs bowing in the wind. He searched until his breath came in clouds and his legs gave out beneath him. The blood trail faded into the forest's frozen silence. Jack dropped to his knees among the ferns and drifted snow, staring at the place where the tracks vanished. His eyes stung, not just from the wind or the bite of winter, but from the raw ache of loss. Ash, the wild companion who'd saved his life and defended his home, was gone. Whether the bobcat had died among the pines or dragged itself deeper into the wilderness to lick its wounds, Jack would never know. He sat for a long time, letting the cold seep into his bones, mind looping back over the storm's violence and the moments before the machine had finally sung out its warning. He thought of Ash's golden eyes, fierce and defiant in the darkness, the flash of claws against the intruders, the way wildness itself seemed to rise up in the night and push back against fate. He owed the bobcat more than he could ever repay. When at last Jack rose, the sun was barely a rumor on the horizon, casting the island in cold, merciless light. He limped back to the cabin, every step a reminder of what had been lost and saved. The warning device was silent now, its job complete. Jack set it gently on the remains of the table, running a finger over the metal casing, a small, battered tribute to the generations who'd fought storms and odds alike. He set to work, as much to keep moving as to make sense of the aftermath. He patched holes with tarps and driftwood, swept the glass from the floor, salvaged what tools and supplies he could. The radio crackled with news from the mainland, how the sudden, urgent signal from a lonely island had reached the Coast Guard and the towns along the bay, sending boats inland, clearing docks, saving lives as the worst of the storm made landfall. There were voices, some seeking the man who'd sent the warning, some in disbelief. But Jack kept the radio low, content to remain a mystery for now. Everywhere, reminders of Ash lingered, the tufts of fur, the scratches in the porch post, the half-empty food dish near the steps. Jack paused by the doorway, looking once more to the woods where the bobcat had vanished. He whispered a wordless thanks, the kind that only the wind and the wild could carry. Night fell cold and clear, the storm a memory etched in bruises and ruins. Jack lit a lantern and sat in the remains of his cabin, the silence broken only by the crackle of fire and the distant roar of the sea. He'd saved the lives of strangers. He'd kept his grandfather's promise. But the cost was written in blood on the snow and in the emptiness where his only friend had been. As the fire burned low, Jack made a vow, not just to rebuild the cabin or finish the work his grandfather began, but to honor the fierce, wild bond that had changed him. In the cold dark, hope took root, not as comfort, but as purpose. Whatever came next, Jack Turner would not turn away. The days after the storm passed in a blur of exhaustion, solitude, and stunned reflection. Jack moved through the wreckage of his life, with hands hardened by work and a heart strangely unburdened. The sea had taken nearly everything, the porch, the windows, a wall, even Ash. But in the stillness that followed, something fragile and new began to form. From the mainland, the first to arrive were the rescue boats. Their hulls scraped the battered dock as uniformed men and women leapt out, scanning for survivors, calling Jack's name. He met them with wary eyes and shoulders squared by the burden of recent days. They looked over the broken cabin, the damage, and the battered machine that had sent its urgent warning across the bay. Some recognized him from years before, a Navy face they'd seen at parades or in the papers. But none tried to dig into the wounds of the past or the secrets beneath his floorboards. News spread quickly along the coast. The story of a lone veteran who, against all odds, had braved the worst storm in a generation and sent out a warning that saved hundreds of lives. Fishermen who'd once mocked Jack in the diner now nodded with silent respect when his name came up. Old neighbors he barely remembered sent up care packages and wordless gestures of gratitude. A loaf of bread, a set of dry blankets, a new lantern. Even the authorities arrived, not with suspicion, but with medals, letters of commendation, and a quiet, genuine thanks. Jack found himself at the center of attention he never sought. He accepted their praise with humility, never mentioning the true cost, the loss of Ash, the silent battles fought in the rain, the shadow of violence that still lingered on the island's edge. At night, he listened to the storm-damaged forest, half hoping for the return of a familiar shape at the tree line, the gleam of golden eyes in the dark. But Ash never came back. The wild belonged to itself, and Jack understood that now better than ever. With the cabin nearly uninhabitable, Jack slept in a makeshift tent by the ruins, the cold and damp a constant companion. Yet he found purpose in the tasks at hand. He cleared the debris, stacked the salvageable wood, and repurposed every bent nail and broken shingle. Bit by bit, the old shack transformed, not just patched or repaired, but remade as something sturdier, more resilient, and for the first time, built with the community in mind. He contacted local officials, sharing his grandfather's blueprints and notebooks with engineers and meteorologists from the state university. They came out to the island, fascinated by the device and the family legacy that had nearly been lost to time and storm. Together, they brainstormed improvements, drew up new plans, and even offered funding to rebuild the cabin as a proper research station, one dedicated to storm monitoring and coastal safety. Rather than just shelter and solitude, Jack found himself working alongside students and scientists, neighbors and old friends, their laughter and energy filling the ruins with new life. The island was no longer a fortress to hide in, but a crossroads where stories and skills mingled, where each act of rebuilding was a small rebellion against isolation and fear. He noticed a change within himself, too. The bitterness and shame that had dogged him after leaving the Navy faded with each passing day. He no longer felt haunted by the past or defined by what he had lost. Instead, he became part of a larger effort, driven not by pride or legacy, but by the quiet conviction that knowledge and courage could change the world, one storm at a time. The new building rose where the old cabin had stood, its walls insulated against wind and rain, its foundation anchored deep into the bedrock. Solar panels gleamed on the roof, and a modern weather antenna bristled against the sky. The community helped whenever they could, some with skilled hands, others with hot food or stories told around evening fires. Jack realized, in these moments of connection, that home wasn't defined by four walls or a family name. It was something found in purpose and in people, in acts of care and shared hope. On the first calm night after the new station's completion, Jack stood at the cliff's edge, staring out at the restless Pacific. The world was quiet but alive, the moon painting silver on the dark water. He thought of Ash, the bobcat who had wandered into his life and taught him that survival sometimes means trusting what cannot be tamed. He thought of his grandfather, whose stubborn faith in invention had saved more lives than anyone would ever know. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and salt. Jack closed his eyes and breathed deep, feeling at peace. He was home, not because the island belonged to him, but because he had chosen to belong to it, to those who would come after, to the community that had rallied around one man's act of courage and one wild animal's sacrifice. The work wasn't finished. There would be more storms, more challenges, and more lonely nights. But Jack Turner no longer felt lost or out of place. He had become a part of something larger, a steward of both memory and hope. And in that, he found a home more real than any cabin ever could be. Time moved differently on the island after the storm. A quiet, gradual healing marked by the turning of seasons and the steady work of hands determined to rebuild. Where once the cabin had crouched against the rocks, stubborn and battered, now the research station stood proud and purposeful. Its windows shone with the glow of late-night study. Its antennas caught every shift of wind and barometric pressure, and its walls sheltered those who had come to protect the coast from the next inevitable blow. Jack grew used to company. The voices of students and scientists, the laughter of townsfolk come to help or just to marvel at the transformation. Children from the village came on field trips, eyes wide as they peered through microscopes and studied the battered remains of the warning device that had saved so many. Evenings were filled with the scent of driftwood fires and the hum of quiet conversation. The memory of loneliness faded, replaced by a new tapestry woven from connection and shared ambition. Still, on certain nights, when the wind shifted and the island grew hushed, Jack would find himself standing at the edge of the cliffs, staring out over the endless sweep of black water. He'd trace the jagged scars in the bark of the old pine tree, the marks left by ash during the long, desperate struggle to defend their home. In those moments, he felt the presence of his wild companion more sharply than ever, not as a loss, but as something eternal, a reminder that even the briefest encounter with nature could echo across a lifetime. He remembered the look in Ash's eyes, wary, fierce, alive with a will that refused surrender. That spirit had changed him in ways no medal or title ever could. It was a lesson born not of comfort, but of risk, of trusting the unknown, of fighting for something bigger than himself. Jack saw it now, in the hands of a young engineer tracing circuit diagrams, in the determination of a coastal officer braving gale warnings to test a new sensor, in the old fisherman who came to share stories of storms survived and loved ones lost. He saw it, too, in the land itself, how battered pines sent out fresh green shoots, how wildflowers crept into the clearings left by the storm, how the battered earth recovered, scarred, but thriving. The research station became more than just a monument to Jack's grandfather's work. It was a place where knowledge and wildness met, where the line between human and nature blurred into mutual respect. Jack encouraged each new visitor to spend time in the woods, to listen for the call of owls at dusk, to feel the pulse of the living world beneath their feet. He told them stories, not just of circuits and radios, but of the bobcat who had appeared when all seemed lost, and whose silent strength had helped turn the tide. One morning, as Jack finished tightening a bolt on a new weather sensor, a reporter from a Portland news station asked him what it all meant. The rebuilt station, the warning that saved so many, the risks he'd taken for people who might never know his name. Jack thought of Ash, the battered cabin, his grandfather's steady hands, and all the nights when hope had seemed a distant, flickering light. "It's not about legacy," he finally said, voice rough with truth. "It's about what you're willing to protect, even if no one ever thanks you for it. Sometimes all it takes is a single encounter, a wild animal on a stormy night, a chance to do the right thing, to change everything. That's what stays with you. That's what matters." Word spread, and soon the station's visitor log filled with entries. Scientists from other coasts, storm chasers, families whose homes had been spared. People shared their own stories of close calls and wild rescues, of the moments when nature forced them to act, to adapt, to grow. A movement began, a quiet pledge along the Pacific coast to honor the land, the water, and every fragile life bound to them. Years slipped by, each one marked by new storms, new challenges, new hands carrying on the work. Jack never forgot the night of the great storm, nor the bond he'd shared with Ash. He knew now that the truest legacy wasn't a name etched in stone or a medal pinned to a jacket. It was the will to protect, to face fear and uncertainty, to give something back, to leave the world safer for those who would come after. On a bright spring morning, Jack planted a young pine on the cliff's edge, in the spot where Ash's trail had last vanished into the trees. The sapling swayed in the ocean breeze, its roots finding hold among the rocks, a symbol of resilience and hope. As he stepped back, he looked out at the endless horizon and smiled, knowing that, like the bobcat, like the battered coast, like every survivor who found courage in the face of loss, he was part of something that would endure. So for those who listen to this story, Jack's message is simple. True legacy isn't measured in wealth or praise. It's found in the moments you choose to protect life, human, wild, and yet to come. Sometimes, a single encounter with nature can change your destiny forever. Do you believe it? If you have a story, share it. Your legacy might begin today.